Hello, my friend. I am glad you are here, however you found your way to this particular corner of the internet tonight. Whether it was on purpose or by accident, whether you have been here before or this is the first time, I am genuinely glad you are here. You have come to rest, and I am going to help you do exactly that. We are going to spend the next little while together, you and I, and by the end of it, I hope you are somewhere warm and soft and far away from whatever today asked of you. Before we begin, I want to ask you one small thing. If this channel has ever helped you sleep, or helped you feel a little less alone at the end of a long day, would you consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing if you haven't already? It costs you nothing, and it genuinely matters. It helps this little channel find someone else who needs it. Someone else lying in the dark who could use a quiet voice and a good story. That is the whole reason this exists. So if you feel moved to, I would be grateful. Now, where are you tonight? I always want to know, are you in a bedroom somewhere in the Pacific Northwest? Rain coming in off the water, the window slightly fogged at the edges. Are you in a flat somewhere in the north of England? A radiator clicking quietly in the corner, the street outside gone mostly still. Are you in a kitchen in Melbourne, the house finally yours? A cup of something warm going cold on the counter beside you. Wherever you are, I want you to know I think about that, the particular place you are listening from. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I read every single one. I mean that. Now, before anything else, let the phone or the tablet or whatever you are holding drop a little. Let your shoulders fall. You have been carrying them up around your ears all day, and you do not need to anymore. Unclench your jaw. That is where most of us hold the day, and we do not even notice until someone points it out. Let it go soft. And your legs, let them go heavy. Let them feel like they belong to the mattress or the cushion or whatever is beneath you. You do not have to go anywhere. You do not have to do anything. Just breathe. In through the nose. Out slow. Good. Comfortable? Let me take you somewhere. Here is the thing about Leonardo da Vinci. You already know him, or you think you do. The genius, the visionary, the man who painted the Mona Lisa and dreamed of flying machines 5 centuries before anyone flew. That version of Leonardo is real. I am not going to take it away from you. But tonight I want to tell you about a different version, the one that history mostly skipped past. The one that lived not on the walls of museums or in the pages of textbooks, but in approximately 13,000 pages of private notes that Leonardo spent his entire life writing in a script almost no one alive could read. Right to left, mirror reversed, every letter flipped, his left hand moving across the page in the opposite direction from the way every other educated person in Renaissance Italy was taught to write. For centuries, people assumed this was simply a quirk. An eccentricity, the charming oddity of a man too original to do anything the ordinary way. But I want to suggest to you tonight, and I think the evidence, when you sit with it, genuinely supports this, that it was something more than that those notebooks, in their strange reversed hand, in their thousands of pages of drawings and questions and half-finished thoughts, were something closer to a life kept secret, a mind in hiding, a man who was, in certain very specific and very human ways, afraid. Tonight we are going to open those notebooks together. We are going to read what was in them, and we are going to ask, quietly, honestly, gently, what was Leonardo da Vinci actually trying to hide? The year is 1476, Florence, a city on fire with beauty, and a young man of 24 has just become the subject of an anonymous accusation. The notebook weighs almost nothing in your hand. That is the first surprising thing. You might expect it to feel significant, to carry some physical reminder of what is inside it. But it does not. It is small, perhaps the size of your palm, bound in leather that has gone soft and darkened with age. And when you hold it, the pages shift slightly, the way old paper does, settled into their curl after 5 centuries of existing. The ink has gone brown. Iron gall ink does that. It oxidizes slowly over decades, moving from black toward this particular warm darkness, the color of dried leaves or strong tea. The pages are slightly rough under the fingers, not unpleasant, more like touching very fine cloth than what we now think of as paper. And then you turn it over, because you have heard about this, and you look at the writing. It goes the wrong way. Every line of text moves from right to left across the page. Every letter is reversed, the curve of every E opening rightward instead of left, every dit. A mirror of itself, every word readable only if you hold the thing up to a mirror or have trained your eye, over years of looking, to read it as it is. The handwriting itself is extraordinarily controlled. It is not the scrawl of someone writing quickly. The letters are small and consistent and precisely formed. You are looking at a system. You are looking at something deliberately made. And the question that sits at the center of this whole conversation, the question I want to spend tonight exploring with you, is simply this: why? Why would a man write this way? Not occasionally. Not in moments of haste or whimsy, but consistently, every day, across an estimated 7,000 pages of surviving material, across decades of a working life. Why would he choose to write in a direction that almost no one around him could read? I think the answer matters. I think it tells us something about Leonardo da Vinci that his paintings, for all their extraordinary power, do not quite tell us. The paintings were made for other people. The notebooks were made for himself, and he wrote them in a direction that kept them that way. Let me set the scene for you properly, because I want you to feel where we are. The year is sometime in the 1480s. Florence, which will matter enormously as we go on, is already behind Leonardo. He has moved north to Milan, to the court of Ludovico Sforza, a man who employed him less as a painter and more as a general engineer of extraordinary things. But the habit that concerns us now began earlier and continued later. It accompanied Leonardo everywhere he went, the way a private language accompanies someone who has carried it so long they no longer remember learning it. Imagine the room, a candle burning close, tallow or beeswax, throwing its particular warm and slightly unsteady light across a working surface. Outside, if it is Milan, the smell of the canals that ran through the city in those years, a faint mineral damp that came through the shutters no matter the season. The fire, if there is one, throwing warmth against one side of the face and leaving the other cool. The city outside making its ordinary sounds, hooves on stone, the distant call of someone in a courtyard, the thick silence that settles after midnight. And Leonardo, sitting with his left hand moving across the page, right to left, letters forming in reverse. He is writing about water. He is almost always writing about water, or light, or the movement of birds in a column of rising air. He is writing things like, and here I am summarizing the content of these notebooks rather than inventing his words. He is writing about the way shadows fall differently in candlelight than in daylight, about the precise musculature of a horse's shoulder, about whether the moon generates its own light or borrows it from the sun. He is writing grocery lists and financial accounts and angry little notes about apprentices who have stolen from him. He is writing the contents of a mind that was, by any measure, one of the strangest and most capacious minds that ever existed in a human body. And all of it goes right to left, all of it reversed. Let me tell you something about mirror writing, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because understanding it mechanically is the first step toward understanding what it meant for Leonardo. For a left-handed person writing with a traditional quill or reed pen, there is a real physical problem. The pen is inked, and ink is wet, and if you write left to right, the standard direction for Italian, for Latin, for virtually every language Leonardo would have used, your left hand drags through the letters you have just made. You smudge your own work, you ink your own hand. It is uncomfortable, and it creates a mess. Mirror writing, right to left, solves this immediately. The left hand moves away from the completed letters, never touching them. The writing flows cleanly. Other left-handed figures of the Renaissance found various workarounds. Some were simply trained out of left-handedness entirely, since the period's educational culture strongly pressured right-handed writing. Others angled their paper. Others learned to arch their hand above the line in a way that avoided smearing. There was no single solution, but there were many solutions available. Leonardo chose this one, and Walter Isaacson, whose 2017 biography of Leonardo is one of the more scrupulously researched accounts of the man's life, makes a point that I find worth sitting with. He notes that while the physical comfort of mirror writing for a left-hander is real, Leonardo's script is too controlled, too consistent, too deliberate to be explained by physical convenience alone. Carlo Pedretti, the great Italian scholar who spent the better part of his career cataloguing and studying the Leonardo manuscripts, and who is widely considered the foremost authority on the notebooks, similarly argued that Leonardo's mirror writing bears all the marks of a practiced, intentional system rather than a casual personal habit. It is not the hurried reverse scrawl of someone taking quick notes. It is precise. It is trained. It is, in some meaningful sense, a choice. Which means that Leonardo, who wrote about everything, who filled approximately 7,000 surviving pages with observations and questions and plans and diagrams and doubts and calculations, who wrote in the margins of his own drawings and across the blank spaces of anatomical sketches and on small sheets he folded and kept in his pockets, that Leonardo chose to do all of this in a script that required specific knowledge or a specific instrument to read. He chose to be readable only to those who knew how to look. I find this genuinely moving, and I want to tell you why before we go any further. There is something in the image of a man who spent his life observing and recording the visible world, who looked at everything with a kind of attention that most of us can barely imagine, and who nevertheless kept his own observations behind a mirror. Not a wall, not a lock, a mirror. The notebooks were not impossible to read. They were simply reversed. Anyone who knew about the mirror writing and held the page up to a looking glass could read them. Leonardo knew this. He was not creating an unbreakable code. He was creating a threshold. He was saying, to read what I actually think, what I actually see, what I actually carry inside me, you have to make a small, deliberate effort. You have to choose to look at me the right way. The biographer Sherwin Newland, writing about Leonardo in his book on the Renaissance mind, suggested that the mirror writing was part of a broader pattern in Leonardo's life, a pattern of making his inner world almost but not quite inaccessible, present but reversed, visible but requiring translation. We will come back to what he was hiding. Tonight, we are going to go through it layer by layer: the illegitimate birth, the criminal charge, the secret bodies he dissected by candlelight, the loves he may never have named, the extraordinary and quietly devastating sense of failure that ran like an underground river beneath the most celebrated life of the Italian Renaissance. But I wanted to start here, with the hand, with the ink, with the page going the wrong way under the left hand of a man who saw more clearly than almost anyone who has ever lived, and who wrote it all down in a direction that required you to look twice. The hill town of Vinci sits above the Arno Valley like something placed there with particular care, a cluster of stone buildings on a ridge of the Apennine foothills, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards that in early spring carry a smell so specific and so particular that once you have read descriptions of it, you find it difficult to imagine Leonardo da Vinci beginning anywhere else. The earth up there is red, not metaphorically red, genuinely, almost disturbingly red, the colour of old terracotta, and when the spring rains come, it releases a smell like something between iron and bread, something mineral and alive at once. The olive trees are silver green in the April light. The Arno, far below in the valley, catches the sun in long, shifting ribbons. It was into this particular world, on the 15th of April 1452, that Leonardo was born. I want to sit with that date for a moment before we go anywhere else, because I find something genuinely touching in what we know about the circumstances of his birth, and I think it matters to everything that comes after, to the notebooks, to the mirror writing, to the secrecy the title of this video asks us to think about. Leonardo was born illegitimate. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a notary, a man of documents, of official language, of legal standing in the Florentine system. His mother, Caterina, was a local peasant woman, probably in her mid-teens at the time of Leonardo's birth. The historical record on Caterina is frustratingly thin. We know her first name because it appears in a brief entry in the grandfather's household book. Antonio da Vinci, Leonardo's paternal grandfather, wrote it down in that careful, matter-of-fact way that people in the 15th century recorded the arrival of children. A grandson was born to me, the son of Ser Piero my son, on the 15th day of April, a Saturday, at the 3rd hour of the night. He noted that the child was baptized Leonardo. He noted the names of 10 godparents. He did not record Caterina's family name. He simply wrote, Caterina, as though she had no last name, as though she were a detail rather than a mother. The biographer Walter Isaacson, in his 2017 study of Leonardo, notes that Caterina was probably from the local area and was, by all evidence, simply not of the class or standing that Ser Piero could marry. Ser Piero had other plans. Within the year of Leonardo's birth, he married a woman named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori, a proper match, a notarial match, the kind of marriage that moved a professional man forward through Florentine society. Caterina, for her part, married a local man named Antonio di Piero Buti, known as Acatabriga, a nickname meaning something close to the quarrel seeker, and she went on to have 5 children with him. Leonardo was not among them. Let me take you somewhere specific now, because the scholars disagree about exactly how Leonardo's earliest years were arranged, and the uncertainty itself is worth sitting with. The most likely reconstruction, and it is a reconstruction, an inference from fragmentary evidence, is that Leonardo spent his first few years, perhaps until the age of 4 or 5, living with or near Caterina and his stepfather in the Vinci countryside. Not in the town proper, but in the farms and hamlets of the surrounding area, places of rough stone walls and low doorways, of animal smells in the early morning, of bread baked in outdoor ovens, of the particular cold of Tuscan farmhouses in winter, when the stone holds the night chill until well into the afternoon. Then, at some point in early childhood, he moved into his grandfather Antonio's household in Vinci itself, taken in by the paternal family, acknowledged by his father, given access to a world of some education and relative comfort, but never, at any point, fully made legitimate. His father, Ser Piero, acknowledged him. That is important. He was not abandoned, he was not hidden, he was present in the family's life, visited, educated, eventually brought to Florence and placed in the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio when he was perhaps 14 or 15 years old. Ser Piero saw the boy's gifts, and he arranged something real for him. This was not a cold or cruel father, by the evidence available, but, and this is the particular thing I find myself returning to, the thing I think shapes everything about who Leonardo became and how he chose to move through the world. Let me tell you something about illegitimacy in 15th century Florence, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Not in the direction of cruelty exactly, but in the direction of a very specific and very quiet kind of exclusion. Florentine society in the 1400s was not a society that destroyed its illegitimate children. Bastards, the word was used plainly, as a legal category rather than an insult, could own property. They could work. They could achieve social prominence in various fields. The Florentine Catasto, the tax survey of 1427, reveals that something like 15% of Florentine households contained children of uncertain or illegitimate status. It was not rare. It was not, in most contexts, catastrophic. But the guild system was a different matter entirely. The guilds were the bones of Florentine professional life. To practice a trade, to call yourself a notary, a doctor, a merchant of certain grades, a member of the major or minor arts, You needed to belong to the relevant guild, and guild membership, in many cases, required legitimate birth. Not always, and not uniformly across all guilds, but for the notarial guild, the Arte dei Giudici e Notai, the guild of judges and notaries, the requirement was clear enough that Leonardo, despite being the son of one of its practitioners, could not follow his father into that profession. The path his father walked, the professional identity Ser Piero carried through the streets of Florence in his good clothes with his leather satchel of documents, that path was simply not open to Leonardo, not by poverty, not by lack of intelligence, by the accident of the circumstances of his birth. The art workshops were different. Artists in the Painters' Guild, the Compagnia di San Luca, were not subject to the same legitimacy requirements. This is why, the historian Martin Kemp has suggested, the placement of Leonardo in Verrocchio's studio was not merely a recognition of talent, but a practical solution to a real limitation. The world of art was, in this particular sense, a world that would take him. I find something quietly heartbreaking in that. Not because a life in art is a lesser life. Leonardo's life in art was, obviously, among the greatest lives anyone has ever lived, but because it is worth noticing that the first large decision about what Leonardo would become was shaped not entirely by what he wanted, but by what he was allowed. We cannot know what Leonardo felt about this. The records do not reach that far inside. He was a child. Children do not always know what they have lost. But the biographer Isaacson has written, carefully, that Leonardo's illegitimacy created in him a lifelong orientation toward the unofficial, the self-taught, the outside of formal structures. He never attended a university. He had no Latin until he taught it to himself in middle age. He called himself Homo Sanza Lettere, a man without letters, without formal learning, and while this was partly a rhetorical move, a way of positioning his empirical method against the authority of ancient texts, it was also, perhaps, something truer and more private than rhetoric, something that began in a farmhouse above the Arno, in the particular red-earthed world of the Vinci Hills, where a boy with an extraordinary mind was being raised in the space between two families, belonging fully to neither. Back with our Leonardo now, and the particular shape that early positioning would leave on a life. There is something in that image, the boy between households, between worlds, neither fully peasant nor fully the notary's son, that I think of as the first and most private room in Leonardo's inner architecture, the room where the habit of existing slightly outside the official categories was first formed, not as a wound exactly, or not only as a wound, but as a disposition, a way of standing in relation to the world that would in time make him constitutionally comfortable with a kind of brilliant invisibility, comfortable working in private, thinking in private, keeping his deepest work in notebooks no one else could easily read, in a hand no one else could easily follow, in a script that ran against the direction of the world. The mirror writing didn't begin in childhood, but perhaps the impulse behind it did. The tamburo was a wooden box. That is all it was, a box mounted to the exterior wall of the Palazzo della Signoria in the heart of Florence, with a slot cut into its face wide enough to admit a folded piece of paper. It had been placed there by the officers of the night, the Ufficiali di Notte, and it sat in the open air of the street, at the height of a man's chest, in a city where everyone passed and no one needed to stop. You could walk by it on an ordinary morning. You could slow your pace almost imperceptibly, let a piece of paper fall from your fingers into the slot, and continue walking without ever breaking your stride. No signature required, no accountability, no face attached to what you had just done. In the spring of 1476, someone used it. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. This particular section of Leonardo's life is one that biographers have handled with varying degrees of care over the centuries, sometimes avoided entirely, sometimes sensationalized in ways that distort rather than illuminate. I am not going to do either of those things. What I want to do is lay out exactly what we know, exactly what we don't know, and then sit with you inside the silence that surrounds it. Because that silence, I think, is the point. That silence is the thing this section of Leonardo's story is actually about. The accusation was received on the 7th of April, 1476. The document that survives names 4 individuals, all accused of the same crime: sodomy, with a 17-year-old male model named Jacopo Saltarelli, who was known in Florence as a goldsmith's apprentice and, according to the denunciation, as someone who had serviced many others. The 4 accused men included Bartolomeo di Pasquino, a goldsmith; Bacino, a tailor's assistant; Leonardo Tornabuoni, a young man with connections to the powerful Tornabuoni banking family; and Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, described in the document as residing with the painter Andrea del Verrocchio. Leonardo was 23 years old. The charge was serious in a way that is difficult to fully convey across 5.5 centuries. Sodomy in Florence was not merely a moral transgression. It was a criminal offence subject to prosecution, and depending on the circumstances, the age of the accused, the number of prior offences, and the political climate of the moment, the penalties could range from substantial fines to public flogging to, in the most severe cases, death. The case was brought before the officers of the night. 2 months later, in June of 1476, all 4 men were acquitted. The records use the phrase assoluto, with the condition that no further evidence came forward. In November of the same year, a second anonymous accusation was placed in the tamburo. The case was examined again. The 4 men were acquitted again. And that is everything the official record tells us. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the officers of the night, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, not for what it was, but for how carefully and methodically it operated. Ufficiali di Notte e dei Monasteri, to give the body its full name, was established in Florence in 1432. Its mandate was the prosecution of sodomy, and it was one of the most active judicial bodies in the city for the better part of a century. The historian Michael Rocchi, in his extraordinary 1996 study, Forbidden Friendships, Homosexuality and Male Culture in Renaissance Florence, analysed the surviving records of the officers of the night across several decades and found that the body processed accusations against approximately 17,000 individuals during its period of operation, in a city whose entire adult male population numbered perhaps 40,000. The scale of this is worth pausing on. Rocchi's research suggests that roughly 1 in every 2 Florentine men at some point during the 15th century came under scrutiny from this particular magistracy. The system of anonymous denunciation was central to its operation. The wooden boxes, the tamburi, were placed at multiple locations across the city, and any citizen could deposit an accusation without identifying themselves. This meant the system was simultaneously a genuine mechanism of social control and an instrument that could be used to settle personal scores, to destroy business rivals, to remove inconvenient people from the social landscape. The officers of the night understood this, and they treated anonymous accusations with a degree of skepticism. They required corroboration before proceeding to serious punishment. Political connections, as Rocchi demonstrates, also mattered enormously. The wealthy and the well-connected faced lighter consequences. The poor and unprotected faced the full weight of the law. Leonardo, in 1476, was neither fully wealthy nor fully unprotected. He was a young man of genuine talent, working in one of the most respected studios in Florence, with no particular political shield of his own, but with Verrocchio's name, and crucially, with a co-accused who bore the Tornabuoni name and its attendant protections. The acquittal, when it came, almost certainly reflected the social weight of that name as much as anything else. Back with Leonardo now, in the spring months of 1476, in the period between the first accusation and the acquittal. We cannot know what those 2 months felt like from the inside. The notebooks, which would eventually cover thousands of pages of his interior life, were not yet what they would become. And even when they were, Leonardo did not record this, not once. In the entire surviving corpus of his notebooks, across approximately 7,200 pages, there is no mention of the accusation, the trial, the tamburo, the name Jacopo Saltarelli, the officers of the night, or the spring of 1476. The absence is total. I find that genuinely extraordinary. I think about it more than I probably should. Walter Isaacson, in his 2017 biography, notes this silence and treats it as significant, not as evidence of guilt or innocence, which the historical record cannot determine, but as evidence of something Leonardo did with frightening things. He sealed them away. He did not process them in writing. He did not leave a crack in the wall through which we might see him frightened. The biographer Serge Bramley, writing in his 1992 study, Leonardo, the Artist and the Man, suggests that the trial marked a genuine turning point in Leonardo's willingness to live visibly in the social world. Before 1476, Leonardo was, by all accounts, a young man of considerable personal charm and social ease, beautiful, according to contemporary descriptions, gifted at conversation, musical, comfortable in company. After 1476, something shifts. The withdrawal is gradual, but it is real. Imagine the particular cold of a Florentine spring morning, not the cold of winter, which is expected and has its own dignity, but the cold of April, the kind that arrives after a warm day and finds you unprepared, that gets into the gap between your collar and your neck. Stone underfoot, the smell of the river drifting up through the streets, organic and ancient. The Palazzo della Signoria rising above the square, its tower a dark pencil against a sky that cannot quite decide what it is doing. Somewhere on that building, or near it, is a wooden box with a slot in its face. And somewhere in that box is a piece of paper with Leonardo's name on it, written in a hand he will never identify. We can imagine him knowing. It was a small city. These things moved through the streets the way water moves, finding every crack, filling every low place. He would have known that someone had reached into the machinery of the city and pointed it at him. And then the notebooks, in the years that follow, become what they were not quite before, locked, mirror-written, compressed, private in a way that goes beyond the natural privacy of a working document. The mirror script, which Leonardo had always used to some degree, becomes in the late 1470s and 1480s the default mode, the only mode, for his private thought. The most frightening day of his early life left no trace in the record he kept of himself. That erasure, I think, is the first and most important thing Leonardo ever hid. Not in the notebooks, in the space where the notebooks go quiet. The workshop smells of linseed oil and something sharper underneath it, the mineral bitterness of ground malachite, the faint animal warmth of egg yolk mixed into tempera that has been sitting too long in the heat near the brazier. It is Milan, sometime in the mid-1480s, and the studio of Leonardo da Vinci occupies a wing of the Corte Vecchia, the old court attached to the castle of Ludovico Sforza, the man who calls himself the Duke of Milan, and who is, at this particular moment in history, the most important patron Leonardo has ever had. The apprentices are at the grinding stones. You can hear it, the slow, circular crush of pigment against porphyry, a sound like distant millwork, rhythmic and low, punctuated by the scrape of a palette knife. The ceiling is high, and the stone walls hold the cold even in summer, so that the candlelight, pooled around the work tables, feels warm by contrast in a way that it does not feel warm in a smaller room. The panels are large. The preparatory work takes months. Assistants move between pools of light and shadow carrying small ceramic cups of medium, careful not to spill. And somewhere in this room, or perhaps in a room adjacent, a private room, the particular kind of private that a man of Leonardo's standing has negotiated for himself. Leonardo himself is not painting. He is writing. The notebook is small enough to hang from his belt, and he keeps it there, this one, for observations made in the street, in the marketplace beside the canal, but there are others, larger, spread across a table that is separate from the painting table. And what he is writing is not notes about the commission. It is not thoughts about the Virgin of the Rocks, which Ludovico's court has been waiting on, with varying degrees of patience for some time. It is not preparation for the great equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, which Leonardo has also promised, and which does not yet exist even as clay. What he is writing, in his careful reversed hand, moving right to left across the page in a script that no apprentice standing behind him can read without effort, is a theory about water. Specifically, why water, when it moves around an obstacle in a river, does not behave the way most natural philosophers have assumed. He has been watching the Naviglio Canal. He has been watching the mill races outside the city walls. He has spent, by any honest accounting, more time watching water move this month than he has spent moving a brush. I want to pause here for a moment and be honest with you about something, because I think this is genuinely the most interesting thing about Leonardo, not the genius, not the paintings, but this particular split, this double life he was living, right at the center of his most professionally important relationship. He was, on paper, Ludovico Sforza's court painter and engineer. He had a salary, he had rooms, he had access to the castle, to the court, to the most sophisticated intellectual and artistic circle in northern Italy. In exchange, he was supposed to produce things, paintings, sculptures, pageants, festival decorations, hydraulic engineering schemes for canals. The list was long and specific and existed in writing. And Leonardo, for 20 years in Milan, delivered some of those things, genuinely extraordinary things, including The Last Supper, one of the most important paintings in human history. But he delivered them late, or partially, or after detours so long and so consuming that the patron's patience became a running feature of the historical record. The question I keep coming back to is not whether Leonardo was a difficult client to manage. He obviously was. The question is, what was he doing instead? And the answer, written in mirror script across thousands of pages, is that he was doing the work he actually cared about, and he was hiding it. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the patronage system in Renaissance Italy, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising how much power it gave patrons over artists, and how much more surprising it is, against that backdrop, that Leonardo got away with what he did. In 15th and 16th century Italy, artists did not have careers in the modern sense. They did not have galleries representing them, or collectors bidding on their work at auction after the fact, or the freedom to spend years on a private project and then release it when they judged it ready. They had patrons, and patrons were employers in a very direct, contractual, often uncomfortable sense. Contracts for major commissions specified not just what was to be painted, but sometimes how much of the artist's own hand had to be in it. Because patrons were paying for the master, not the workshop. They specified pigments. The use of ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, was often mandated in contracts because it was the most expensive pigment available, and its presence in the painting demonstrated the patron's wealth. The contracts specified deadlines. They specified penalties for non-delivery. The historian Michael Baxendale, in his essential work, Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, documented in precise detail how thoroughly commercial these arrangements were, how little the romantic notion of the freely inspired artist matches the economic reality of Renaissance studio practice. An artist who failed to deliver could be sued, could lose the advance payment, could be publicly shamed in a city where reputation was everything, and where the next commission depended entirely on word of mouth from the last patron to the next one. There were artists who suffered exactly this fate, who took the money, delayed too long, and found themselves frozen out of the patronage networks that fed them. Leonardo knew all of this. He had grown up in Florence, trained in Verrocchio's workshop, watched how the system worked. He understood what was owed. And yet he also understood, with what the biographer Walter Isaacson describes as a remarkable degree of self-knowledge, that he could not stop himself, that the investigations always expanded, that a question about the flow of water led to a question about the movement of blood, and the question about blood led to a question about the structure of the heart, and the question about the heart led, weeks later, to a theory about the formation of fossils in mountain rock. And by that point, the painting had been standing in the corner of the studio, untouched for a month, and Ludovico's secretary had sent another letter. What is genuinely remarkable is how much latitude Ludovico actually gave him. There are accounts of Ludovico personally visiting the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie during the painting of the Last Supper, and finding Leonardo standing motionless in front of the wall, not painting, simply looking, for an entire afternoon. Ludovico did not throw him out. He complained, and he threatened, and he wrote letters, and then he waited, because the thing Leonardo eventually produced, when he produced it, was worth the waiting, in a way that was obvious even to a patron who did not entirely understand what he was looking at. But here is what I find genuinely moving when I sit with this particular section of Leonardo's life. The notebooks, the ones hidden in mirror script, the ones piling up on that cold table in the Milanese studio, while the linseed oil dried on a canvas across the room, are not the record of a man shirking his responsibilities. They are the record of a man who could not help himself, who was in the grip of something larger than the contract, larger than the salary, larger than the considerable social consequences of failure. The biographer Sherwin Newland, writing about Leonardo's anatomical work, described him as a man possessed by a need to understand, not just to see, but to know the mechanism underneath the seeing. And we can extend that description across all of it: the water studies, the geology, the optics, the flight of birds. These were not hobbies. They were, if we read the notebooks with the seriousness they demand, Leonardo's deepest work, the thing that painting, for all its glory, was sometimes too narrow to contain. There is a passage in the notebooks, not a quote I will attribute directly, because the notebooks are complex documents and translation is a matter of scholarly debate, but a passage in which Leonardo writes, in his reversed hand, about the relationship between the eye and the mind, about the failure of the hand to keep pace with the imagination. The historian Martin Kemp, who has spent decades with these documents, has described Leonardo's notebooks as the record of a mind in perpetual pursuit of something it could not quite reach. And the mirror writing, I think, is part of that. Not just a habit, not just a left-hander's convenience, a firewall, as I said, between the man the patrons were paying for and the man who stayed up by candlelight in a cold room in Milan, watching the way shadows moved on a stone wall, trying to understand the light. Back with Leonardo now. In that studio, the candles have burned lower, the apprentices have gone to their beds, the pigment is covered, the palette cleaned, the panel no longer visible in the dark, and Leonardo is still writing. The boy arrived in the summer of 1490. His name was Gian Giacomo Caprotti da Oreno, and he was 10 years old, and Leonardo was 38, and the notebooks, those private, mirror-written, right-to-left documents that Leonardo kept from almost everyone, record his arrival the way they record almost everything, in careful, transactional detail. Leonardo wrote it down. He wrote down the date. He wrote down the boy's age. He wrote down, with what the biographer Walter Isaacson describes as a kind of stunned specificity, that within the first 12 months, the boy had stolen money from him on at least 2 documented occasions, had stolen a silver point stylus from one of Leonardo's colleagues, had stolen money from another apprentice, had sold or pawned something belonging to the workshop, and had eaten, without apparent guilt or apology, an entire quantity of food that had been set aside for a different purpose. Leonardo called him Il Salino, the little devil. I find this detail, this particular nickname, genuinely difficult to set down without wanting to sit with it for a moment, because it is not the name you would give someone you resented. It is not the name you would write in your notebook again and again for 26 years if the person named was someone you were simply tolerating. Il Salino. The little devil. There is something in that name that sounds almost tender. Exasperated, certainly, but tender. And I think that tenderness is the thing the notebooks are almost completely unable to say directly. Which is exactly what makes this section of Leonardo's life so worth sitting with. The narrator returns you to Milan, to the late summer of 1490, to Leonardo's workshop in the city, where he had been living and working under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, for nearly a decade. The workshop smelled of linseed oil and ground pigment, of the particular dusty warmth of stretched canvas, and the faint metallic bite of the silver point tools racked along the wall. Outside in the Milanese street, the summer market noise drifted in through the high windows, the sound of cartwheels on cobblestone, the calls of vendors selling dried herbs and bolts of cloth, the occasional sharp cry of a child. The city was loud and warm and alive, and Leonardo was in the middle of it, surrounded by apprentices and assistants, and the constant pressure of commissions he had already promised and was already behind on. Into this household came the boy. He was small for 10, or perhaps not. We don't actually know what he looked like yet, though Leonardo would later describe him in notes that historians have pored over as having curly hair. The records suggest he came from a village outside Milan, from modest circumstances, brought perhaps by his father or by an intermediary, to serve as a garzone, a workshop boy, in the household of a man who was already famous in the city. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the role of the garzone in a Renaissance artistic household, because I think it will help you understand just how extraordinary what follows actually is. The garzone, the workshop apprentice, was a well-understood social institution in 15th century Florence and Milan. Boys from modest families were placed in the households of skilled craftsmen and artists, typically between the ages of 8 and 14, to learn a trade. The arrangement was almost contractual in its expectations. The master provided housing, food, clothing, and training. The boy provided labor, obedience, and the gradual accumulation of the master's techniques, which he would eventually carry into his own independent practice. The relationship was hierarchical and practical. Boys ground pigments, stretched canvases, cleaned brushes, ran errands, posed for figure studies when a model was needed. They were taught to mix colors, to prepare panels, to understand the geometry of perspective. In a well-run workshop, the arrangement was mutually beneficial. The master gained reliable assistance, the apprentice gained a craft, and, eventually, a livelihood. What the master was not expected to do, what no surviving account from the period treats as remotely standard practice, was buy the apprentice embroidered shirts, or silver-buckled shoes, or cloaks of the kind of fabric that cost more than a working family might spend on clothing in a year. But this is what the notebooks record. Leonardo kept accounts of what he spent on Salai with the same meticulous mirror-script precision he brought to recording the dimensions of a wing or the mechanics of a water wheel. Historians examining these notebooks, and the scholar Carlo Pedretti devoted considerable attention to them, have found itemized lists of garments purchased, shirts trimmed with silver thread, stockings of a particular fine weave, shoes with buckles of a kind that were not the clothing of a workshop boy. They were the clothing of someone Leonardo was presenting to the world in a specific way. The other apprentices in the workshop are not recorded in this manner. Their names appear occasionally, in relation to tasks assigned or wages paid. Salai's name appears across decades, attached to purchases, to noted thefts, to small complaints, and then, persistently, to the evidence of continued, almost bewildering loyalty. Let me bring you back now to the workshop, to the smell of the Milanese market drifting through the windows, to the particular sheen of fine silk in afternoon light. The thefts continued. The notebooks record at least 5 distinct incidents in the first 2 years, and Leonardo wrote them all down with an almost literary precision. The silver point stylus taken from Marco Giorgiono, the money lifted from a pocket, the small persistent dishonesty of a boy who seemed to understand, perhaps with the unerring instinct of children, exactly how far he could push. And Leonardo recorded it all and kept him for 26 years. This is the thing I want you to stay with for a moment. Not the thefts, not the clothing, but the arithmetic of 26 years. Salai remained in Leonardo's household from 1490 until Leonardo's death in 1519. He appears in Leonardo's will. He received paintings. He received property. He received, in the end, a significant portion of everything Leonardo had to leave. The scholar Martin Kemp, in his careful and authoritative study of Leonardo's life and work, notes that the depth of this attachment, whatever its precise nature, was one of the most durable facts of Leonardo's adult life. A man who left almost everything else unfinished, who abandoned commissions and lost interest, and moved between cities and between patrons, kept this one relationship for the whole of his mature life. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because this is a section of Leonardo's biography where the historical record is genuinely incomplete, and where it is very easy to say more than the evidence allows. Scholars have debated the nature of Leonardo's relationship with Salai for a long time. Leonardo had faced, in 1476, a serious legal crisis, an anonymous accusation of sodomy involving a 17-year-old male model named Jacopo Saltarelli. The case was brought before the officers of the Knight in Florence, the civic authority responsible for prosecuting sodomy, and was eventually dismissed, but it was not nothing. It marked him. It was, the historian Michael Rocchi has noted in his detailed study of Renaissance Florentine sexual culture, part of a broader pattern of surveillance and prosecution that made same-sex desire both present and dangerous in the city Leonardo came from. What the notebooks do not contain, what they are almost entirely silent on, is any direct expression of what Leonardo felt for Salai. The emotional content is not there. What is there instead are the transactions, the shirts bought, the money stolen, the shoes with silver buckles, the years of recorded proximity, the notebooks, which contain Leonardo's most private thoughts on painting and water and light and death, go almost completely quiet when it comes to the interior of this relationship. The biographer Isaacson has suggested that this silence is itself a kind of evidence, not of concealment exactly, but of something Leonardo could not or would not put into words, even in the privacy of his mirror-written pages. I think about that more than I probably should, because what it means is this: a man who wrote down everything, who recorded the angle of shadows and the curvature of rivers and the precise stages of a candle flame, kept the emotional truth of the most significant personal relationship of his life almost entirely hidden, not in a locked box, not in a destroyed letter, hidden in plain sight in the gap between what the notebooks record and what they refuse to say. The name appears again and again. Salai, Salai, Salai. The little devil, the curly-haired boy who arrived in the summer heat and stole things and stayed and stayed and stayed. And Leonardo kept writing his name, for 26 years, in his careful, reversed private hand, in ink that has not faded. That I find genuinely moving. The candle was small. That is the first thing to hold in your mind as we go into this section. Not the grand torchlight of legend, not the illuminated scriptorium of a scholar at comfortable work. A single small candle, or perhaps two, set close to the table where the body lay, close enough to cast useful light on what Leonardo was doing, close enough that the heat of the flame occasionally reached the backs of his hands as he bent over the opened cavity of a chest, a shoulder, a skull. The candlelight would have caught the wetness of internal tissue and made it gleam. It would have thrown the muscles into relief, each one casting a small shadow that helped define its edge, its thickness, its direction of pull. Leonardo the painter would have noticed this. The same eye that understood how light raked across a cheekbone to create the illusion of depth was now watching how candlelight moved across a dead man's opened hand and revealed, in that same raking angle, the precise branching of the tendons beneath. This was not a comfortable room. The stone floors of the hospital rooms and monastery spaces where Leonardo conducted his dissections held the cold of the Florentine November, the way stone always does. From the inside out, a cold that does not yield to the presence of bodies, living or dead. He would have worked in his cloak. The smell, and I will not shy away from this because Leonardo himself did not, was the particular smell of human decomposition mixed with the vinegar that was used to slow the decay process, to buy the anatomist more time. Sharp and sweet simultaneously, in the way that no other smell quite is. It clung to clothing. It followed him home. He wrote about it. In his notebooks with that characteristic flatness that I find more striking the more I read it, Leonardo noted the practical difficulties of the work, the need to work quickly, the way the body changed between sessions, the value of a cold night for preservation. He was matter-of-fact in the way that surgeons learn to be matter-of-fact, or the way, I think, a person becomes matter-of-fact when the alternative is to stop working, and Leonardo could not stop. Over the course of his career, he is believed to have dissected approximately 30 human bodies. The historian and biographer Walter Isaacson, writing in his 2017 biography, Leonardo da Vinci, traces the arc of this work across two main periods: the years at Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, where Leonardo had access to bodies through a relationship with the hospital, and the later period in Rome, where he worked at the hospital of Santo Spirito. These were not authorized medical dissections of the kind conducted at the great universities of Bologna and Padua before audiences of students by licensed physicians following prescribed protocols. What Leonardo was doing was something quieter, more private, and in important ways more dangerous. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the legal and religious landscape he was moving through, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising. Dissection in Renaissance Italy existed in a complicated state that was neither fully legal nor fully forbidden, but was instead, in the way of many things in that world, dependent entirely on who you were, who protected you, and who was watching. The universities at Bologna and Padua had conducted anatomical demonstrations since the late 13th and 14th centuries, with the Church's toleration, if not always its explicit blessing. These were formal, public, pedagogical events. A body obtained from the executed criminal population, a physician reading aloud from Galen while a surgeon made the cuts, an audience of medical students watching from tiered seating. The purpose was instruction. The body was eventually buried with appropriate rites. What Leonardo was doing was neither formal nor public nor pedagogical in any conventional sense. He was not a physician. He held no university position. He was an artist, which in the Renaissance carried genuine intellectual prestige, but was not the same thing as the kind of sanctioned scholarly authority that provided legal cover for anatomical work. The Church's position on the body was rooted in the doctrine of bodily resurrection. The physical body mattered, which meant the physical body deserved a certain respect in death, and the cutting open of corpses for private purposes occupied a grey area that could, at any moment, be rendered black. And eventually, it was. In Rome, sometime around 1515 or 1516, Pope Leo X prohibited Leonardo from continuing his anatomical work at Santo Spirito. The historical record on the exact circumstances is incomplete. Scholars, including Martin Clayton, who has written extensively on Leonardo's anatomical drawings, note that what survives of the documentary evidence suggests a complaint was made against him, possibly by a German assistant named Giovanni degli Specchi, who accused him of practicing some form of sacrilege. The details are murky. What is clear is that the prohibition was real, and that Leonardo, by this point in his 60s and in declining health, did not resume large-scale dissection after it. The great project of his anatomical treatise, which he had been assembling for decades, which he genuinely intended to publish, which would have been one of the most significant medical texts ever produced, remained unfinished. It was never published in his lifetime. Back with Leonardo now, in the cold room, in the specific hour before dawn when the candle has burned low enough that he has had to replace it. What he found inside the body was extraordinary, even by the standards of what we now know. His drawings of the chambers of the heart, the ventricles, the valves, the way blood moves through a system he was trying to understand from first principles, are accurate in ways that stunned physicians when the notebooks were finally studied seriously in the 19th and 20th centuries. He drew the fetus curled inside the womb with a precision that would not be matched until the development of modern imaging. He worked out the mechanical logic of the shoulder joint, the way the muscles attach, the angles of force, the geometry of rotation, through a combination of dissection and the engineering thinking that informed everything he did. He saw the body as a machine, and he admired it the way he admired all beautiful machines, with something close to reverence. The quill moved across paper between incisions. That sound, the dry scratch of it in a silent room, is the sound I find myself returning to when I think about this section of Leonardo's life. The scratch of the quill, and then the picking up of the knife again, and then the scratch of the quill once more. He was translating what he saw into a form that could outlast the body in front of him. And yet, there is something in the matter-of-fact tone of his anatomical notes that I think deserves a moment of quiet attention. Because behind the clinical precision, behind the careful observation of how decomposition progressed, the practical notes about vinegar and cold air, the professional detachment of a man recording data, was a man alone in the dark with a human body, asking the oldest question there is. Walter Isaacson has noted that Leonardo's anatomical work was never purely medical in its motivation. He was not trying to become a physician. He was not conducting this work for a patron. He was, the biographer suggests, trying to understand what life is, where it resides, what exactly happens when it goes. We cannot know what he felt in those rooms. The notebooks give us the observations, not the interior. But it is tempting, genuinely tempting, to imagine that the matter-of-factness was itself a kind of protection, a way of holding something enormous at a manageable distance, the clinical voice as a shelter from the thing the clinical voice was describing. He kept this work almost entirely hidden, not from everyone. There were trusted colleagues who knew, and the hospital relationships that gave him access were not secret to those who arranged them, but from patrons, from the church in its official capacity, from the world that commissioned Madonnas and battle paintings, and wanted from Leonardo the products of his genius rather than the method of it. The anatomical notebooks sat in private. They were not circulated. They were not published. When Leonardo died in 1519, they passed to his pupil Francesco Melzi, and Melzi kept them, and after Melzi died they were scattered, some lost, some sold, some eventually reaching the royal collection at Windsor, where many of the anatomical drawings remain today. A man alone in a cold room, working by candlelight, asking questions no one had commissioned him to ask. That is what was in the notebooks. The candle has burned low. You can tell by the way the light has changed. It is no longer the clean, steady flame of an hour ago, but something smaller now, something that moves when it should not move, flickering against a draught that comes from nowhere in particular, throwing shadows that lean and recover and lean again across the page. The room is large and mostly dark. The smell is tallow, or perhaps beeswax if the evening has been generous, with underneath it the faint mineral smell of ink and the drier smell of paper that has been handled many times. Outside, Milan is quiet in the particular way of a winter night. Not silent, because cities are never truly silent, but quieted, the street noise pressed down under cold air and the weight of late hours. A dog somewhere, the distant sound of the cathedral settling, and at the table a man writing. He is writing from right to left. The letters are reversed. The page, held to a mirror, would resolve into ordinary Italian, a compressed, personal hand, quick in some places, deliberate in others. But read straight on, as you or I would read it. It looks like a code, like something meant to be kept. And here is what he is writing, on this particular night or one very much like it, because he wrote lists like this one throughout his notebooks, and we can place them in no single moment, but know they existed across years of his life. Get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a circle. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Ask Benedetto Portinari by what means they walk on ice in Flanders. Get a master of hydraulics to tell you how to repair a lock, a canal, a mill in the Lombard manner. Observe the goose's foot. I find these lists, I want to be honest with you about this, among the most genuinely moving things I have ever encountered in years of reading about historical figures. Not the paintings, not the anatomical drawings, extraordinary as those are, these lists. Because what these lists are, if you look at them plainly, is a record of everything Leonardo da Vinci did not yet know and was desperate to learn. They are a private inventory of his own ignorance, and he was considered, even in his own lifetime, the most gifted mind in Europe. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the world Leonardo was moving through when he made these lists, because I think it will genuinely change how they land. The Renaissance studiolo was one of the most interesting inventions of the educated European mind. The word simply means a small study, a private room set apart from the rest of the household, where a man of learning could organize his intellectual life. These were not, in the 15th and 16th centuries, incidental spaces. They were designed with real intention. Federico da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, had a studiolo of inlaid wood panels so precisely constructed that the shelves and books and instruments depicted in the marquetry created an illusion of depth, a trompe-l'oeil of a scholar's life rendered in walnut and beech. The room itself was a statement about what it meant to be a man who thought. Inside a studiolo of Leonardo's era, you might find, depending on the wealth and interests of the owner, manuscripts and codices arranged with care, the pages smelling of vellum and old binding, an astrolabe, perhaps a set of mathematical instruments, cool and precise to the touch, dried specimens, plants pressed flat between boards, a globe or a set of maps, perhaps a small bronze figure on a shelf, catching the candlelight on its curve. The educated humanist of the period understood the cultivation of learning as an active, ongoing project, something you maintained and organized and tended, the way you tended a garden. The notebook tradition that Leonardo participated in, the Zibaldone, the commonplace book, the working journal, grew from this same culture of deliberate self-cultivation. You wrote things down to hold them. You organized your questions to answer them. You made lists of what you needed to know. What Leonardo did with this tradition was something rather different, and something rather more extraordinary, and something rather more private. The scholar Martin Kemp, who has spent much of his career working through Leonardo's notebooks, and whose 2004 work, Leonardo, remains one of the essential accounts of his intellectual life, has written about the sheer scope of Leonardo's lists of inquiry, not just the things he had observed or knew, but the things he still needed to find, confirm, verify, understand. The biographer Walter Isaacson, cataloguing the notebook entries in his 2017 biography, notes that the to-do lists represent something beyond simple organization. They are evidence of a man in a state of permanent, restless, sometimes anxious curiosity. A man who understood his own knowledge not as a territory he had claimed, but as a horizon he was perpetually failing to reach. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. This particular entry stops me every time. Here is a man who has dissected human corpses in secret, by candlelight, in the anatomy theatres of Florence and Milan and Rome. A man who has drawn the chambers of the heart, the branching of the bronchial tree, the articulation of the shoulder joint, in such precise and accurate detail that anatomists 400 years later would still be consulting his drawings. And he does not know, and he needs to know, how the tongue of a woodpecker works. Because he does not yet know, and he needs to. Because the universe is so much larger than one mind. Back with Leonardo at his table. We cannot know, of course, exactly what he felt when he wrote these entries. The notebooks do not often give us direct emotional testimony in the way a letter or a diary might. But the biographer Serge Bramley, in his careful and deeply researched account of Leonardo's life, has written about the particular quality of tension that runs through the working documents. The gap, which becomes visible across hundreds of pages and decades of work, between what Leonardo wanted to know and what he could in any one lifetime actually come to know. That gap, Bramley suggests, was something Leonardo was genuinely conscious of and genuinely troubled by. It is tempting to imagine the feeling. You are understood by everyone around you as a man of universal genius. Patrons commission paintings from you because your reputation precedes you like weather. Apprentices come to you, rulers write to you, and at night, in the candlelight, with the draught moving the flame and the winter cold pressing against the shutters, you are writing down the things you still do not understand. You are writing down the masters you still need to consult. You are writing down the questions that have been sitting in your chest for months unanswered because the hours are never enough and the learning never ends and the world is so much more complicated than anyone, than even you can hold. The lists are evidence of something the public legend of Leonardo almost entirely suppresses, that behind the universal genius was a man who spent his private hours cataloguing his own inadequacy. Not with despair, exactly. The lists read with a kind of forward energy, a reaching toward, but with something that sits close to urgency. The tongue of the woodpecker matters. The mechanism of ice walking in Flanders matters. The squaring of the circle matters. These things matter because everything matters, and there is not enough time, and there has never been enough time. The candle shrinks another increment. The flame leans again and holds. Outside, the Milanese night deepens into the particular stillness of the hour before anything begins to stir again. And at the table, the left hand moves across the page from right to left, the letters forming their reversed shapes, the lists accumulating. Not a record of mastery, but a record of longing. A private monument to everything the most gifted mind of the age still burned to understand, and wrote down quietly, in code, where no one else would read it. The clay smelled of earth and river water. It smelled of the kind of soil you find near the banks of the Ticino, dark, mineral-rich, faintly cold even in summer. If you had stood in the courtyard of the Sforza Castle in Milan sometime in the early 1490s and looked up, you would have seen it rising above you, 24 feet of horse, modelled in clay, the largest equestrian sculpture anyone in Europe had attempted since antiquity. The nostrils were flared. The neck was arched with something that looked almost like impatience. The legs were positioned, and this alone had cost Leonardo years of argument with himself, in a walking pose rather than rearing, a compromise reached after he determined that a rearing horse of that scale could not support its own bronze weight without the structure beneath it failing. The thing was enormous. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary objects a human being had ever made with his hands, and it was made of clay. It would never be anything else. Let me tell you about the Sforza horse project, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, not just as a story about Leonardo, but as a story about the particular cruelty of ambition colliding with the limits of the physical world. Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, commissioned Leonardo sometime around 1482 to create an equestrian monument to his father, Francesco Sforza. This was not an unusual commission in principle. The Renaissance was full of bronze equestrian monuments, and Leonardo was not the first artist to attempt one at large scale. But Ludovico wanted something that would announce the greatness of his family to anyone who looked at it. He wanted something unprecedented. And Leonardo, being Leonardo, agreed, and then proceeded to make the project 3 times more complicated than it needed to be. What he was attempting was, by the engineering standards of the late 15th century, genuinely close to impossible. Bronze equestrian statues of the scale Ludovico wanted had not been successfully cast in a single pour since ancient Rome. The technical challenge was not merely artistic, it was metallurgical and structural. A statue of that size would require an extraordinary volume of molten bronze, poured simultaneously into a mold of breathtaking complexity, with every air pocket controlled, every channel for the metal calculated in advance. A single error in the mold, a single unexpected pocket of trapped air, and the whole thing could crack, collapse, or simply fail to fill. Leonardo spent years, scholars estimate as many as 16 years intermittently, designing and redesigning the casting method. He filled notebook pages with calculations for the furnaces, the channels, the mold construction. He corresponded, it appears, with other engineers. He built the clay model itself as a working proof of concept, a demonstration of what the finished bronze could be. And then, in 1499, the French invaded Milan. Ludovico Sforza fled, and the French soldiers, quartered in the city, used the clay horse for target practice. The biographer Walter Isaacson describes this moment with appropriate brevity. The model was destroyed. Decades of work. The most extraordinary sculptural project of the Italian Renaissance. Gone, not in a fire, not in a flood, but in what amounted to a casual act of military boredom. There is no bronze horse, there is no clay horse. There are only the notebook pages, the calculations, the sketches of horses' legs and necks and musculature, the engineering diagrams for furnaces that were never built. The horse exists only in Leonardo's handwriting, moving right to left across the page. Back with Leonardo now, and with the pattern this horse represents. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned in 1481, was never finished. It sits in the Uffizi in Florence today in its underpainted state. Extraordinary, genuinely one of the most remarkable underpaintings in Western art, but unfinished. Abandoned when Leonardo left for Milan. The St. Jerome in the Wilderness, now in the Vatican, was never completed. The Battle of Anghiari, a massive mural commission for the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence, begun in 1505, was not only abandoned but physically deteriorated during Leonardo's own lifetime due to problems with his experimental technique. The painting did not survive him, it barely survived the painting. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is the part of this section worth sitting with. We tell the story of Leonardo da Vinci as a story of overwhelming genius. And that story is true. The notebooks alone make it undeniable. But there is another story running alongside it, quieter and harder to look at, which is the story of a man who was haunted by what he could not finish. The art historian Kenneth Clark, whose 1939 study, Leonardo da Vinci, remains one of the most careful and personal accounts ever written of this particular life, argued something that I find genuinely moving. Clark suggested that the notebooks were not simply a record of Leonardo's thinking, they were, in some fundamental way, compensation for the fact that the paintings and sculptures and engineering projects kept not being finished. The notebooks were a place where nothing ever had to be complete. A drawing could always be revised. A question could be left open. A line of inquiry could extend across years and decades without ever arriving at a conclusion that might disappoint. In the notebooks, incompletion was not failure. It was simply the nature of the thing. Clark wrote, and I am paraphrasing carefully here, because the original formulation matters, that Leonardo's notebooks gave him a world in which the impossible standards he set himself could not ultimately be tested. Bronze is unforgiving. Paint on a wall either holds or it doesn't, but ink on paper can always have more ink added. The notebook was perhaps the one place where Leonardo was entirely safe. Safe. The narrator voice returns to the courtyard. It is 1499. The clay horse still stands, for now. The light in Milan in late autumn has a particular quality. low and grey, coming off the Po Valley flat and cold, without the luminosity of Florence or the deep blues of the Venetian sky. The horse's clay surface has dried slightly at the edges. Where it was smoothed and polished by Leonardo's hands and tools, it catches the grey light and holds it. Where it was left rough, in the folds of the mane and around the hooves, the shadow collects and deepens. Leonardo, we know from the notebooks, had already left for other commissions. He would not be there to see what the French soldiers did, but the leaving itself tells us something. He had already, in some private way, released it. The notebooks contain a line, real, documented, written in Leonardo's own mirror script, translated and quoted by scholars including Martin Kemp in his essential study, Leonardo, in which Leonardo wrote something that has stopped readers for 500 years. The precise translation varies slightly, but the substance is this, that he felt he had offended God and mankind because his work had not reached the quality it should have. Some accounts render a related passage as something close to a lament. Tell me if anything was ever done. We cannot know the exact moment in which that line was written, or what specific failure prompted it, but the biographer Serge Bramley has noted that passages like this appear more than once in the notebooks, in different forms, across different years. This was not a single dark night. It was a recurring weather pattern in Leonardo's inner life. A man measuring himself against a standard he had set and finding, again and again, that the distance between the idea and the made thing was too great to bear. The clay horse, the abandoned adoration, the deteriorating battle, the bronze that was never poured. What the notebooks were hiding, in this particular layer, was not a secret that could embarrass him politically or legally. It was quieter than that, and, in some ways, harder to hold. The notebooks were hiding a man who was afraid, genuinely, privately, across decades, that he had not done enough, that the universe had offered him more than he had managed to return. The clay smelled of the earth, the horse stood in the cold Milan light and waited for something that did not come, and Leonardo turned back to his pages, where the questions were still open, where the drawings could still be revised, where nothing yet had to be finished. The Arno moves through Florence the way it has always moved, unhurried in summer, urgent and brown in winter, carrying with it the smell of river mud and the particular cold that rises off moving water even on warm afternoons. Stone piers interrupt its surface, and where they do, the river does something that Leonardo da Vinci, standing on the bank or leaning over the parapet of a bridge, watched with an attention so sustained and so particular that it must have looked, to anyone passing by, like a kind of illness. The water meets the stone and divides. It curls away from the obstacle in long, spiraling arms. It folds back on itself. It creates in miniature a world of tremendous complexity, and then it smooths over, and the surface looks simple again, and the pattern is gone. But Leonardo had seen it. He had seen it many times. And he was convinced, in a way that organized decades of his life, that what he had just seen was not a curiosity about water, it was a clue about everything. I want to tell you something about Leonardo's notebooks that I find genuinely difficult to put down once I've picked it up. We talk about him as a painter. We name the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the Vitruvian Man. These are real and extraordinary things. But when you actually look at what he spent his time on, page by page, year by year, a different picture emerges. The scholar Martin Kemp, who has spent more of his life thinking about Leonardo than perhaps anyone alive, has noted that of the approximately 7,000 surviving pages of notebook material, a remarkable proportion is devoted to a single subject, the movement of water. Not painting technique, not anatomy, though that is close behind. Water, the way it moves, the patterns it makes, the forces that govern it, the way it carries things with it and deposits them and erodes them and shapes the land over centuries so slowly that no human being can watch it happen, but Leonardo tried anyway, to think himself into the time scale where it would be visible. He watched the Arno. He watched drainage channels and irrigation ditches and mill streams. He watched water poured from a jug into a basin, catching the exact shape of the vortex before it dissolved. The narrator puts you beside him on a particular afternoon, the particular quality of Florentine afternoon light, which is golden and slightly amber in autumn, falling across the surface of the Arno so that you can see, if you look carefully, the differential speeds of the current. The water moves faster at the center. It is slower near the banks, where it drags against the mud and the trailing stems of vegetation. Leonardo saw this. He measured it with the instruments available to him and with his eyes, which were instruments finer than anything his century could manufacture. He reached into the notebooks and wrote, in his mirror script, right to left, each letter reversed, a description of the water's movement around an obstacle that, the historian and scientist Domenico Lorenza has argued, anticipates by 2 centuries the kind of fluid dynamics that would not be formally theorized until the 18th and 19th centuries. He drew the spirals. He drew the secondary vortices that form behind the primary vortex. He noted how the pattern depended on the shape of the obstacle, the speed of the current, the depth of the channel. He filled pages. He filled dozens of pages. He could not stop. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the state of hydrological knowledge in Leonardo's time, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising how alone he was in what he was doing. Before Leonardo, the intellectual tradition in Renaissance Europe dealt with water primarily through the texts it had inherited from classical antiquity. Vitruvius on aqueducts, Archimedes on displacement and buoyancy, Aristotle on the nature of the elements, which classified water simply as one of 4 fundamental substances characterized by wetness and coldness. These were useful frameworks as far as they went, but they were not frameworks built from watching. They were frameworks built from reasoning, from category, from inherited authority. No one had sat beside a river for years and simply described what they saw in the way a natural scientist would eventually be trained to describe it. The Renaissance did have engineering traditions around water, canal building, flood management, mill construction, but these were practical traditions passed through guilds and workshops, focused on making water do what you wanted, not on understanding why it behaved as it did. Leonardo was working across both worlds simultaneously. On the practical engineering side, he was employed by Ludovico Sforza in Milan on canal design projects, including work on the Navili Canal system, and later he was involved with proposals for flood control on the Arno for the Florentine Republic. He understood the engineering problems from the inside. He knew what it meant when a canal silted up, when a channel deepened unexpectedly, when a flood cut through a new course rather than following the prepared one. But his notebooks pushed beyond the engineering. They asked questions the engineering contracts didn't require and couldn't pay for. They asked why. They asked what principle, if properly understood, would allow you to predict not just this flood, but any flood. Not just this vortex, but the structure of vortices in general. Back with Leonardo now, beside the Arno in the late afternoon. The smell of the river is particular and layered, mud underneath, and something green and alive from the algae on the submerged stones, and in summer, a faint sweetness from the warmth of the water that is almost pleasant and then not quite. He is not simply watching, he is comparing. The historian Kenneth Clark, in his essential study of Leonardo, observed that Leonardo was always doing more than describing what he saw. He was always looking for the pattern beneath the description, the form that would explain the instance. And what Leonardo began to believe, slowly and then with increasing conviction across the decades of his water studies, was that the spiral was not just a feature of how water moves, it was a feature of how everything moves. The vortex was everywhere. He saw it in the movement of air around a wing, and here his aeronautical drawings breathe with the same spiraling logic as his river sketches. He saw it in the way smoke rises from a candle, curling and folding back on itself in patterns he drew with the same loving specificity he gave the Arno. And then, and this is the move that I find genuinely moving, genuinely human in the best sense, He looked inward. The blood moves through the body. Leonardo knew this before anyone had formally articulated the circulatory system, knew it from his dissections, from the chambers of hearts he had held in his hands in the cold of early morning hospital rooms, from the valves he had drawn with such precision that modern cardiologists have confirmed their accuracy centuries later. And the blood, he wrote, moves the way water moves. It spirals, it eddies at the valves, it creates vortices at the bends in the arteries. The same pattern, the same hidden mathematics. Walter Isaacson, in his biography, describes Leonardo as reaching toward what he called a unified theory of the movement of things, a single principle that would explain the behavior of water, air, blood, light, and perhaps force and weight and time itself. He believed this principle existed. He believed it was discoverable. He spent his life trying to find it. He never did. The notebooks are full of approaches, of spiraling attempts, of observations that get very close and then dissolve into other observations, other tangents, other fascinations. We can imagine, and here I want to be careful to say imagine, because we cannot know, what it felt like to carry that particular project across a lifetime, to believe the answer was there, legible in the surface of the water, and to keep watching, and to keep drawing, and to never quite reach the point where the pattern revealed itself completely. The notebooks, in this light, read less like a collection of discoveries and more like a love letter written to an understanding that kept receding. He chased it down the Arno. He chased it in the smoke of his candles. He chased it in the chambers of dead men's hearts. He wrote about water until he could not write any more. And the water kept moving, the way it always had, spiraling around the stone piers of the Ponte Vecchio in that green-brown Florentine afternoon light, making its pattern and then smoothing over it, and being quietly, endlessly beautiful, and giving nothing away. The Château du Clos Lucé sits at the edge of Amboise, close enough to the royal residence of the chateau that the two buildings were connected by an underground passage, a detail that tells you something about how Francis I felt about the old Italian man he had installed there in 1516. The manor house is small by royal standards. Warm stone walls, low-beamed ceilings, a great fireplace in the main hall that smells of oak and ash in the winter months, and windows that face south toward the Loire Valley, where the river moves slowly through the flat French countryside, grey-green in the winter light, blue-silver when the sun breaks through in spring. Leonardo arrived here at 64. He had walked, or been carried, the records are not precise, over the Alps in late autumn, with his notebooks packed carefully into trunks, with Salieri beside him, and with a young Milanese nobleman named Francesco Melzi, who had been with him now for a decade and who would not leave his side again. Let me tell you something about Leonardo's final years in France, because I think you'll find the particulars genuinely surprising. Francis I was 21 years old when he invited Leonardo to France. He had been king for barely a year. He was young, brilliant, intensely ambitious in the particular way that Renaissance monarchs could be, not just politically but culturally. He wanted the greatest minds of the age at his court, the way that other kings wanted armies. He had already acquired an enormous painting called the Virgin of the Rocks. From Leonardo's workshop, he wanted the man who had made it. The terms of the arrangement were extraordinary. Leonardo was given Clos Lucé, the house itself, rent-free, along with a pension of 700 écus per year, one of the largest salaries ever paid by the French crown to a foreign artist. He was given horses, wine from the royal cellars, firewood enough to keep a large house warm through the Touraine winters. He was given, most significantly, almost nothing to do. His title was Premier Peintre, Architecte et Ingénieur du Roi. First painter, architect and engineer to the king, but Francis seems to have understood quite early that the man he had brought to France was no longer capable of painting in the way he once had. Sometime around 1517, probably the result of a stroke, Leonardo's right hand had become partially paralyzed. The biographer Walter Isaacson, in his 2017 biography, notes that a contemporary visitor named Antonio de Beatis observed Leonardo's condition in person and reported that he could no longer paint with his former precision, though he could still draw and instruct students. And so what Francis actually wanted was simpler and perhaps more honest. He wanted to sit with Leonardo and talk. By multiple accounts, including de Beatis's visit record, Francis visited Clos Lucé regularly, using that underground passage between the two chateaux, and simply spent time with the old man in conversation. A French contemporary, the goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini, later recorded Francis saying that he believed no other man had ever been born who knew as much as Leonardo, not just about painting and sculpture, but about philosophy. He said this with what sounds, even at this distance, like genuine awe. I find this detail quietly moving every time I come back to it. This young French king, surrounded by the full machinery of royal court, slipping through an underground tunnel to sit by a fire with an old Italian painter and talk. Whatever they talked about, the movement of water, the structure of birds' wings, the nature of light through glass, it was clearly enough. Francis visited often enough that the historical record preserves it. He cared enough that it became a story people told. Back with Leonardo now, in the house itself, in those final 3 years. He worked. That needs to be said clearly. The right hand was limited but not idle, and his left hand, the hand he had always written with, still moved. The notebooks continued. There are pages dated to the Amboise period, mathematical problems, studies of water, notes on geometry, written in that same careful mirror script, right to left, each letter reversed, the privacy of the handwriting unchanged even now, in the last years, even in this house where he was safe, loved, well-fed, warm. He kept the notebooks private still, right until the end. And in the house with him, through those 3 years, was Melzi. Francesco Melzi had come to Leonardo's workshop in Milan around 1506, when he was approximately 15 years old. He came from a noble Lombard family, the kind of family that did not typically apprentice their sons to painters, and the evidence suggests that his father approved the arrangement not because he needed Melzi to learn a trade, but because something in the boy's character and intelligence made the connection with Leonardo seem worthwhile. The art historian Luc Sisson has noted that Melzi appears in Leonardo's records not as a typical workshop apprentice, but as a companion, a secretary, a devoted presence with a different kind of relationship to the master than the other students had. Leonardo wrote about Melzi in practical terms in the notebooks, the way Leonardo wrote about almost everything he felt most deeply, sideways, obliquely, in the language of arrangement and provision, rather than in the language of feeling. He noted Melzi's expenses. He recorded things Melzi had done. He left, in his will, an extraordinary provision. To Melzi, Leonardo bequeathed all of his books, all of his instruments, and all of his notebooks. Not money, not property in the conventional sense, the entire life's work of his mind, the trunks of mirror-written pages, the 7,000 sheets of questions about the world. We can imagine what it meant that Leonardo chose Melzi for this. He had other students. He had Salai, who had been with him far longer. He left Salai money and the paintings, the physical, saleable, valuable things. But the notebooks he left to the young man who had sat beside him in the quiet of Clos Lucé and watched him write in a hand no one could easily read, in a script that moved backward through time. The records hint at something in that choice. What the notebooks themselves do not contain, what Leonardo apparently could not write directly, even in that private mirror script, even in those pages never meant for other eyes, was what Melzi wrote immediately after Leonardo's death in May of 1519. Melzi wrote a letter to Leonardo's half-brothers, informing them of the death. It has survived. In it, he writes that Leonardo was like a father to him. He writes that the loss of Leonardo is a grief that will remain with him as long as he lives. He writes that it is not in his power to put into words what this loss means. The biographer Serge Bramley, in his biography, Leonardo, the Artist and the Man, describes this letter as one of the most genuinely moving documents connected to Leonardo's life, not for its literary sophistication, but for the simplicity of its devastation. Melzi was not performing grief, he was reporting it. I want to sit with something here, because I think it is the quiet center of what this section is really about. Leonardo spent much of his adult life in proximity to people who wanted things from him, patrons who wanted paintings, rulers who wanted fortresses, admirers who wanted genius on display. He spent years with Salai, who appears in the records with an almost comic consistency around missing money and stolen goods and difficult behavior, and who Leonardo nevertheless kept beside him for 2 decades, which must mean something about what Salai gave back. But Salai's tenderness, if it existed, is not preserved. The record is mostly the debt and the irritation. Melzi gave Leonardo something different. Melzi stayed. Melzi walked over the Alps with him. Melzi sat in the quiet house at Amboise and listened. Melzi was there when Leonardo died, on the 2nd of May, 1519, with the French king, according to a tradition that may be legendary but is old, present in the room. And afterward, Melzi wrote the letter that Leonardo never could have written about himself. He wrote the love directly, plainly, without mirror script, without reversal. He said, "This man was a father to me, and I cannot find the words for what I have lost." The notebooks, in the end, held everything Leonardo could not say, and Melzi, in the end, said it for him. The narrator voice. Francesco Melzi was 26 years old when Leonardo died in the spring of 1519, and he had been with him for nearly a decade. He had come to Leonardo's household as a teenager, the son of a Lombard nobleman, and he had stayed. He was there at Amboise, in the manor house that Francis I had given to Leonardo in his final years, and he was there on the 2nd of May when Leonardo died. The records suggest that Melzi was devoted to Leonardo in the way that people are devoted to those who have formed them, not out of obligation, and not only out of love, but out of something that had become part of the structure of his own life. When Leonardo died, he left Melzi everything: the books, the instruments, the money and the clothes and the tools, and the notebooks, the host voice. I want to pause here for a moment, because I find this genuinely moving in a way I have been sitting with for a while now. Melzi inherited somewhere in the region of 13,000 pages of notebook material, pages covered in that compressed mirror script, pages of anatomical drawings so precise they would not be surpassed for 2 centuries, pages of mechanical studies, water studies, botanical studies, pages that explored the mechanics of flight and the movement of rivers and the architecture of the human heart, pages that nobody, or almost nobody, had ever read. And Melzi took them home to his villa at Vaprio d'Adda, near Milan, and he kept them. For 50 years he kept them. That is what I want you to hold on to as we move through this section. 50 years. Melzi died around 1570, and for all those decades, the notebooks sat in his villa, cared for, preserved, largely unread, because almost no one could read them, because Leonardo had hidden them inside out. The villa at Vaprio d'Adda sits on a bluff above the Adda River, and in the summer, the light off the water comes up through the windows in moving patterns on the stone walls. In Melzi's time, the notebooks were kept in a room. We do not know precisely which room, or precisely how they were stored, whether in chests or in stacks or bound in some early fashion. What we know is that Melzi understood their value. He wrote a letter, in the months after Leonardo's death, to Leonardo's brothers in Florence, informing them of the loss. The biographer Walter Isaacson quotes from this letter in his 2017 biography of Leonardo, noting that Melzi described Leonardo as a father to him, and that the grief in the letter reads as genuine and deep. The loss he described was not just the loss of a master, it was the loss of a parent, the loss of the person who had given shape to his life. For 50 years, the notebooks were safe. The host voice. Let me tell you about what happened after Melzi died, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and more than a little painful. When Francesco Melzi died around 1570, the notebooks passed to his heirs, and his heirs did not know what they had. This is the part of the story that scholars of Leonardo's manuscripts have written about with something approaching despair. The Melzi family, the sons and grandsons who inherited the villa and everything in it, regarded the notebooks not as a treasure but as a curiosity, a large, illegible, rather inconvenient curiosity. In the years that followed Melzi's death, the notebooks began to be given away, borrowed, sold, taken. A sculptor named Pompeo Leoni, working for the Spanish crown, acquired a significant portion of the surviving material in the late 16th century, and what he did with it is, from the perspective of anyone who cares about Leonardo's original organization, a quiet catastrophe. Let me step back for a moment here and tell you about Pompeo Leoni, because his role in the history of these pages is one of those details that deserves a fuller telling. Leoni was a Milanese sculptor, the son of Leone Leoni, who had himself collected some of Leonardo's work. Pompeo Leoni eventually acquired what would become the largest single collection of Leonardo's manuscript pages, and he reorganized them with scissors. He physically cut pages, individual sheets of Leonardo's notebook paper, apart, separating drawings from text, regrouping pages thematically, rather than preserving the order in which Leonardo had written them. He mounted the cut pieces onto larger sheets and bound them into new volumes according to his own organizing logic. The result was the collection now known as the Codex Atlanticus, named not by Leonardo, but by later cataloguers, for the large atlas-like format of the pages Leoni assembled. The Codex Atlanticus is now held in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan. It contains 12 bound volumes. It is the largest single collection of Leonardo's papers in existence. More than 1,000 individual sheets, representing some of the most extraordinary pages in the history of human thought. And it is organized in a way that bears almost no relationship to how Leonardo originally arranged his ideas. Scholars have spent decades trying to reconstruct what the original notebooks might have looked like, what order Leonardo worked in, what conversations between pages were severed by Leoni's scissors, what connections between drawings and texts we have lost. Carlo Pedretti, the great Leonardo scholar who devoted his life to this work, spent decades on the reconstruction, and even his formidable expertise could only partially reassemble what Leoni scattered. The host voice. I think about Pompeo Leoni sometimes, and I try to be fair to him. He preserved what he had. He bound it. He kept it from further dispersal. Without his intervention, more might have been lost. But something in his reorganization still troubles me when I think about it. The idea of those original connections, those pages that Leonardo laid alongside each other as part of a single line of thought, being cut apart and rearranged by someone who could not read the script they were written in. There is a particular detail I have been saving for this moment: the 2 Madrid codices. In the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, 2 volumes of Leonardo's manuscripts sat misfiled, or perhaps simply filed in an unexpected location, for nearly 4 centuries. They had been in Leoni's possession, travelled to Spain with the Spanish royal collections, and then simply been lost to scholarly attention. Not destroyed, not stolen, lost in the way that things in large institutions are sometimes lost, present, but invisible. It was not until 1966 that they were rediscovered, by 2 scholars who were simply looking more carefully than anyone had looked in a very long time. 1966, nearly 500 years after Leonardo filled those pages. The narrator voice. Back with Leonardo's pages now, let me bring you back to what those pages mean and what their survival means. Of the estimated 13,000 pages that Leonardo filled during his lifetime, approximately 7,200 survive. The mathematics of that loss are not comfortable. Almost half of everything he wrote and drew is simply gone. Some of it was lost in the dispersal after Melzi's death. Some of it was destroyed, some of it was stolen, and the thefts were never recovered. Some of it passed through so many hands over so many centuries that it dissolved into the anonymous past. What survived did so largely because it was hidden well enough. The Codex Atlanticus survived because Leone bound it, and it travelled to a library. The Windsor collection, held by the British Royal Collection, containing some of the most extraordinary anatomical drawings ever made, survived because it passed into royal hands where it was preserved as a treasure. The Codex Leicester, now owned by Bill Gates, survived a similar chain of careful custody. The host voice. Here is the thing I keep returning to, and I want to be honest with you about it, because I think it is the emotional heart of this whole section. Leonardo hid his notebook so thoroughly, in mirror script, in private shorthand, in dense layered pages that even educated readers of his time found largely impenetrable, that when he died, and those notebooks passed into the world barely knew what to do with them. They were dispersed partly because they were difficult. They were treated carelessly partly because no one could read them. And yet that very difficulty, that very hiddenness, is also what preserved them. The pages that were most accessible, the pages that might have been read, shared, copied, passed hand to hand, were the pages most likely to be lost. The pages that were hardest to read were the pages that stayed in chests, in libraries, in miscatalogued stacks in Spanish institutions for 400 years. What we have is the fragment that the hiding preserved. In the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan today, if you are permitted into the room where the Codex Atlanticus is kept, the first thing you notice is the quiet. It is a particular kind of institutional quiet, the hush of a space that has organized itself around the fact that something irreplaceable is present. The smell of the room is old leather and very old paper and something faintly chemical, the particular scent of preservation, of a human effort to hold time still. The volumes themselves are heavy, the binding is firm, the pages thick with the weight of 5 centuries. When a page is turned by the gloved hands of a conservator, not by yours, the sound is almost nothing, a breath, a whisper of material. And on those pages, still, after all of it, the dispersal and the scissors and the 4 centuries of near loss, Leonardo's handwriting runs backward across the surface, in its small compressed script. The drawings surround it, a wing, a water wheel, the branching of a river, the face of a child or a horse, or there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when a candle is placed in front of a mirror. The flame appears twice, once in the air, once in the glass, and the reflection reverses it so that what was leaning left now leans right, and what was casting light one way now seems to cast it another. The flame is real, the reflection is real, and yet they are not the same thing. The reflection is everything the flame is, and nothing that the flame is, simultaneously. I have been thinking about that image for a long time in relation to Leonardo, and I want to try, here at the end of this long night together, to tell you what I think it means. The notebook is open on the table. It is late, perhaps very late, perhaps the kind of late that has stopped being late and become simply the next day's early hours, the city outside gone quiet, the canal water moving without sound past the walls of the house in Milan, or Rome, or Amboise, wherever he happens to be in this particular season of his life. The candle has burned low. There are several of them, actually. Leonardo worked by multiple flames when he could, and the smell of warm wax is constant, mixed with the faint mineral sharpness of the ink he makes himself. On the table around the open notebook, a human skull, jawbone removed, several cut quills, a jar of water gone slightly brown, pages covered in drawings so dense they look, at a certain distance, like weather, like something meteorological, maps of forces rather than objects. His left hand moves across the page from right to left. The letters form backwards, each one a mirror of its conventional self. He works without apparent effort. This is simply how he writes, has written since he was young, since before anyone thought to ask why, if anyone ever did. The scratching of the quill is soft and steady, a sound like something being confided. This is the section where I want to try to answer the question that has been the thread running through this entire night. What was Leonardo actually hiding? And I want to be honest with you, I don't think the answer is simple, and I don't think the answer is singular. You know that now, if you've been with me through everything we've covered. You know about the sodomy trial and the terror it carried. You know about the illegal dissections, the bodies handled by candlelight in ways the church expressly forbade. You know about the sexuality he never named in any text that survives, the depth of his attachment to Salai, the more tender and more private bond with Francesco Melzi. You know about the intellectual apostasy, the man commissioned to paint devotional images who spent his nights calculating the tensile strength of wings, the geometry of water, the precise musculature of the tongue, all of it hidden in plain sight, written backwards, scattered across thousands of pages that would not be read in any organized way for centuries. But I think there is something else, something underneath all of those particular secrets, something the notebooks hold that is harder to name. Let me try. He draws a fetus. It is perhaps the most remarkable image he ever made, and he made thousands of remarkable images. The fetus curls inside a cross-sectioned womb, drawn with a tenderness and precision that seems, even now, impossible for the technology available to him. He had opened bodies, many bodies, and looked at exactly this. He had held the tissue carefully, noted the way the membranes caught the candlelight, the way the cotyledons of the human placenta are arranged differently than those of a cow, a distinction he was one of the first people in recorded history to observe and document. He writes notes around the image in his mirror script, annotating what he sees. But some of the anatomy is wrong. Not carelessly wrong, wrong in ways that suggest he was working partly from direct observation and partly from received wisdom he could not entirely override, from Galen and from assumption, filling in where the seeing did not quite reach. He saw more than any person before him, and he still could not see everything. Walter Isaacson, in his 2017 biography, returns several times to what he calls the central paradox of Leonardo's working life, the gap between ambition and completion. Isaacson counts the finished paintings, the ones we can attribute to Leonardo with confidence and consider genuinely resolved, and arrives at a number that shocks people when they hear it. Fewer than 20, across a working life of roughly 40 years. A man who planned enormous fresco cycles, who sketched hundreds of compositions, who filled page after page with preparatory studies for works that were begun and abandoned or never begun at all. Fewer than 20 completed paintings. The notebooks are full of lists. Leonardo kept lists of things he needed to do, things he needed to learn, questions he intended to answer. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Find out how ice forms on glass. Describe what sneezing is, and yawning, and the falling sickness, and spasm. These lists go on. They go on across decades, and the biographer Martin Kemp, who has spent more of his scholarly life in Leonardo's notebooks than perhaps anyone alive, has noted something quietly devastating about them. Many of the questions are repeated, not because Leonardo forgot he'd asked them, but because he had not yet answered them, and he knew it. I find this genuinely, and I mean genuinely, not as a word I'm using for warmth. I find this moving in a way I struggle to fully articulate. Here is the most observant person who ever lived. Here is someone who looked at a dragonfly's wing and understood its mechanical structure 500 years before the instruments existed to verify what he was seeing, who watched water move around an obstacle and described turbulence in terms that anticipate fluid dynamics, who dissected the eye and tried to understand how light becomes sight, how the physical fact of a photon touching tissue becomes the interior experience of seeing a face. He looked at everything, he saw everything, and he could almost never close the gap between the seeing and the making. Adoration of the Magi. Begun in 1481, abandoned unfinished, still sitting in a state of rich, ghostly incompletion in the Uffizi. Saint Jerome in the Wilderness. Same era, same incompletion, the figure of Jerome so powerful it seems to be vibrating with feeling, and then the landscape simply stops, unpainted, the panels still bear wood around it. The Battle of Anghiari. The great mural in the Hall of 500 in Florence, worked on for years, deteriorating even as he painted it, because he had experimented with an encaustic technique he had read about in Pliny and could not make stable in the Italian climate. Lost now. Known only through copies. We cannot know what Leonardo felt about this pattern in his own life. He does not say directly. The notebooks are not a diary in that sense. He does not sit down and confide his feelings to the page the way a modern person might. But Walter Isaacson notes, carefully, that there are moments in the notebooks where something like anguish edges through the surface, where the lists of undone things press up against each other with an urgency that feels less like planning and more like self-accusation, where the repeated question, describe this, explain this, understand this, begins to sound, across the decades, like a man arguing with his own inability to stop seeing new things long enough to finish the things he had already started seeing. The candle. He places it in front of a mirror. He does this sometimes, studying the way the reflected light behaves differently from the direct light, the way a flame seen in a mirror has a quality of remove to it, a quality of translation. He writes about this. He writes about the difference between the thing and its reflection. The reflected flame is reversed. Left becomes right, right becomes left. It gives off no heat. It is, in some precise physical sense, not there. And yet it is entirely, visually present. The wax smell is in the air. The warmth is on his face, coming from the real flame, not the reflected one. He studies both. Here, I think, is what Leonardo was actually hiding. Not in any single secret, not in any one layer of the mirror-written notebooks, but underneath all of it, underneath the sexuality and the illegal dissections and the intellectual apostasy and the private grief. Here, he was hiding the distance between what he could see and what he could make. He was the flame and he was the mirror. He could see the thing with a completeness and a precision that no person before him had approached, and perhaps no person since has matched. And he lived inside the knowledge that the representation, the painting, the drawing, the treatise he never finished, was always the reflection, always reversed, always giving off no heat of its own, always beautiful, and always a translation of something that remained, in the original, beyond full capture. The notebooks are not, in this reading, a monument to genius. They are something more private and more human than that. They are the record of everything he saw that he could not complete. Every question asked and not answered, every wing studied and not built, every figure sketched and not painted, every fetus drawn with one hand while the other hand already knew that the drawing was not quite the thing. They are a monument to longing. The longing of a person who saw more than any single life could hold, who understood that the world was always ahead of him, always more complex, always one more dissection, one more observation, one more night at the mirror, with the candle burning away behind him and his reflection watching back, reversed, patient, giving off no warmth of its own. He writes, right to left, the letters backwards. The quill moves across the page in the direction opposite to convention. What he was hiding. Let me bring you back now, gently, to a room. A room in Milan, or perhaps Florence, or perhaps the last quiet house in Amboise, where the light came in slow through the French countryside windows, and the river was always distantly audible, always moving, always going somewhere. A man sits at a table. He is working by candlelight. and the candle has burned low enough that the wax has pooled and begun to cool at the edges, pale and still. He is writing, not from left to right the way you or I would write, but from right to left, his hand moving backward across the page, the letters reversing themselves as they go, so that if you held the page to a mirror, you would see something extraordinary. You would see a mind trying to think, trying to get at something it cannot quite reach, trying, on page after page after page, 7,000 of them, or what remains of 7,000 of them, to close a distance between what he saw and what he could say about what he saw. I keep coming back to that image. The mirror, the reversed hand, the candle burning low. Because I think, and I want to be gentle and honest with you here, because it is late, and I think this deserves gentleness. I think what Leonardo was hiding in those notebooks was not any single thing, not the anatomical drawings made by candlelight over bodies no one was supposed to see, not the record of his arrest, the accusation, the silence that followed, not the self-reproach written in his own hand. Tell me if anything was ever done. Not even the philosophy, the theology, the private wrestling with God and water and the shape of a wave, not any one of those things alone. I think what he was hiding was the distance between who the world needed him to be and who he actually was. And I find myself wondering, here, at the end of this, whether that particular distance is not, in some quiet way, the most human thing about him. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. The dates, the paintings, the names of the men he loved or may have loved, the exact angle of a dissected shoulder, the precise number of notebooks, the trial and the silence after, you can let all of that soften, let it move to the edges of the room the way candlelight does, leaving the center warm and the corners in shadow. What stays, I think, if anything stays, is something simpler than all of it. A person who was trying, who was genuinely, privately, exhaustively trying, who kept notebooks not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he could not stop looking at the world and finding it more complicated and more beautiful and more mysterious than he had found it the day before. Who wrote questions in the margins that he never answered? Who left paintings unfinished not from laziness, but from something closer to its opposite? A perfectionism so severe it became a kind of paralysis, a love of the thing so complete that finishing it would mean letting it go. Who carried, somewhere in the private architecture of himself, a tenderness toward the world that his age had no real language for, and that he had to write backward, in a hand only a mirror could read, to keep safe. Wherever you are tonight, whatever your own evening has held, whatever weight you carried today or are still carrying now into this darkness, I think there is something worth sitting with, very quietly, in the fact that the greatest mind the Renaissance produced spent his life feeling he had not done enough, that he looked at everything he made and saw only the gap between the vision and the thing, that he kept going anyway, page after page, question after question, candle after candle burning down. Let your breathing slow now. Let it find its own rhythm. The room in Amboise is quiet. The river is still there, just beyond hearing. The candle has gone out, or very nearly, and in the last of its warmth the page on the table is covered in writing that runs the wrong way, waiting for a mirror, waiting for someone, waiting maybe for you, across 500 years of silence, to hold it up to the light and read what was always there. You do not need to hold it now. Let your hands go heavy. Let your thoughts go soft at the edges, the way a dream does when you are just at the border of it, just at the place where the story stops being something you follow and becomes something you are simply inside of, warm and unhurried and almost gone. He kept asking questions until the end. He never stopped looking, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that was always the point. Sleep well, friend. Good night, wherever you are.